Good afternoon, everybody. I believe we are live. Today we're talking about the Fourth Industrial Revolution, or 4IR, what it means, what it is, and what it means for us in Africa. And I'm really delighted to introduce you to Professor Tshilidzi Marwala. He's the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Johannesburg and a Deputy to President Cyril Ramaphosa on South Africa's Presidential Commission on 4IR. So welcome, Professor. It's lovely to have you here with us.
No, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to engaging.
Yeah. And I'd also like to welcome our audience who are with us, and hopefully we can present something really interesting for them. And to thank our sponsor, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, who make this webinar possible. We have a lot to cover in an hour, but for those of you who are sitting at home, please drop some questions onto the chat, and I will do my level best to include them in our conversation. But let's dive right in. Prof, I realize there's no defined line between the different industrial epochs, the first industrial, second, third, fourth revolution. But it seems you have been involved in this fourth industrial revolution for longer than many. After all, you were a doctoral student in artificial intelligence 22 years ago. Sorry to age you. Tell us why your fascination with this subject?
Well, the first time I was introduced to artificial intelligence, I was still in high school. When I was in high school, I won the National Science Olympiad. And I attended the Science Week here in Johannesburg from Rwanda. And then I proceeded to go to the United Kingdom to attend the Science Fortnight. And they were talking about the technologies that are going to define the next century. Artificial intelligence was one of them, but the most important one was superconductivity. So I guess that was the first time I actually got introduced to it. Then I forgot about it, and I went and studied regular engineering. And when I was at Cambridge looking for the topic, I sat next to Nando de Freitas, and I said, "What are you working on?" And he said, "Artificial intelligence." I said, "Hey, maybe this looks actually cool," and I pursued it. So it was accidental more than intentional.
Okay. So you've written this book, Closing the Gap, which I must confess, and I'm no expert on this subject at all, but it's probably the best guide to understand. And when I say best guide, it's because it's so accessible, really, to understanding 4IR that I've read. So what prompted you to write the book? I mean, I understand you're immersed in the subject, but a book like this that has a very African flavor and feel.
Absolutely. You see, I have written 18 books. And many of those books, I can't find them in now because they are mainly published in Europe or United States. So I have often wanted to write something that will be accessible to our people. And when I talk about accessibility, in a way, closing the gap, I'm not talking about just the fact that you can go to a bookstore and pick it up, because now you can get all my books on Amazon and on Kindle. I meant also accessibility in terms of the material that is covered, because what I have seen is that much of the books on the topic either they are not simple enough to be able to explain the concepts, which basically means if you have to read them, you must have a certain level of expertise, or they are littered with mathematical equations. I always say that it is important to make things simple, so that everybody can be able to understand. So it was something that I really wanted to write and to contextualize it in my own experience of the African continent, growing up, interacting with my grandmother and my parents and my community, so that we can make this work accessible to everyone.
And your grandmother certainly makes her presence felt in one of the chapters. Your book is broken into these very digestible chunks. So they're headed industry and data and business and society, each with a number of subchapters. And it's interesting to notice that society is the longest and most detailed section, which I believe speaks to its import. But before we get there, I want to ask you a simple question, which probably has a complicated answer, which is, in terms of 4IR, where do we stand as a country?
Well, it is a mixed bag. If we are to compare ourselves with the rest of the world, we are behind. If we are to compare ourselves with the rest of the African continent, we are actually doing quite well. If you look at 4IR in the continent, the country that I've been really quite impressed about is actually Rwanda. In Rwanda, they are delivering medical supplies to rural areas using drones. That is quite important. And obviously, I am the chairman of the Center for Internet of Things in Kigali. It's a government agency there. So I've seen quite a bit of that. If you go to Kenya, you see quite a bit of an ecosystem around the fourth industrial revolution. If you go to Ghana, Google has put a $1 billion American dollar AI lab in Ghana, in Accra. Obviously, there will be quite a great deal of activities with lots of people who work there who do not come from that part of the world. So, but here in South Africa, obviously we have a crisis in our education system. I don't have to go over that, but most certainly, unless we unlock that educational bottleneck, we are always going to fall behind. But if you go to Cape Town and you see what some of our programmers are doing, is actually quite impressive. It's so impressive that Amazon has developers who are developing apps and applications in the fourth industrial revolution technologies just here in Cape Town.
Prof, can I ask you, there's concern though that as a country we are trying to advance, we're trying to move ourselves, we're talking about this fourth industrial revolution without actually having mastered the third revolution, which is incorporating computers into our lives. You can probably articulate that better. Is that a constraint or an opportunity for us? Does it actually matter?
It is actually quite irrelevant, because these things are not a continuation. Of course, I am concerned about the security of supply of our electricity, which is the second industrial revolution technology. Of course, I'm concerned that the electronics industry did not really take hold in South Africa, almost to the point that all our electronic devices, whether it is our phones, whether it is our watches, they are not made in South Africa. They are made outside South Africa. It does concern me, but certainly it is not a constraint for us to start implementing the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. In fact, to the sharp contrary, the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution are much easily implementable than the technologies of the third industrial revolution. Because if you had to start a plant that makes integrated circuits, you need a clean room, you need huge infrastructure. Whereas if I wanted to build an app that will be able to translate from isiZulu to English, all I need is just a small computer. And that computer does not even have to be a supercomputer. If I need more memory, I can go and buy a cloud that will be able to give me the sort of supercomputing capabilities that anybody anywhere in the world actually has access to. So I think the fourth industrial revolution is definitely, in terms of barrier to entry, the most accessible of them all.
Okay. Well, that's encouraging. You talk about how we can use 4IR technology to improve competitiveness or even just improve efficiency in big industrial sectors, so aerospace, in our mining sector, even in Eskom, in our rather sad electricity sector. Do you want to elaborate on and provide us with some examples of how it can be applied in those sectors?
No, absolutely. I think one of the work that I did with quite a number of my students is how do we maintain the integrity of our infrastructure? Basically, in engineering, anything that you see in engineering, it is over-designed. So if we are building a road that is supposed to last for 40 years, we actually build it to last for 80 years, and we call that a safety factor of 2, just in case. Which basically means when you come to systems where you have to maintain infrastructure, and the way they maintain these power stations, if they are doing it well, is that if you have a component that is supposed to work for 2 years, after 2 years, you remove it, whether it is still working or not, because you know the difficulty. I mean, I think a good example is a lift cable, which in the mines they remove it every 6 months. You can imagine if you don't remove it, it might actually break and kill someone. So when you have fourth industrial revolution technologies, you can be able to do what is called predictive maintenance instead of scheduled maintenance. And by so doing, you can extend the life of your infrastructure beyond the traditional scheduled maintenance limits. And of course, the implications of that on finance, on the financial situation, is actually quite extensive. Maintenance of this infrastructure, you can be able to install sensors, Internet of Things, and be able to know before these structures fail, way before these structures fail, that now you are entering the failure zone, replace it immediately. That is one of the examples. And so that same technology can be taken to our hospitals, monitoring the conditions of our patients. The difference is that the structure is no longer an electricity structure. Now it is a human body, and again, to save lives.
So have our friends at Eskom, has Mr. Doreta given you a call?
Well, I am in communication with him. I have, by the way, worked with Eskom on some of these technologies, and I'm quite encouraged by the CEO's attitude towards technology, and I think we're going to see much more progress than what is apparent.
Prof, at the same time as we can harness this technology to make our lives easier and do things more cheaply, there's also a considerable anxiety about the advent of 4IR. If the job losses from this industrial revolution are anywhere near the order of magnitude predicted, it could be devastating. It could be devastating on our economy, where the prospect of 1% growth is exciting at the moment. How can we get around that challenge? Because people are fearful. And we want 4IR to boost the economy rather than harm it, don't we? So is this a significant obstacle?
Well, firstly, I need to put it forward that it is not as if we have a choice, because in the matters of demand and supply, competitiveness is the key variable. If you look at our sectors, shoemaking, clothing, textile sector, that has almost been completely decimated from South Africa. The reason why it was decimated was simply because we were no longer competitive. You could get a good quality product from Asia. And our people, when they go and buy goods and services, they don't first go and ask the question, where was it made? And after they have found out that it is made in South Africa, then they buy. That is not even their concern. They look at quality, they look at price, and then they make their purchase. So the reason why we lost our textile sector is because we were not competitive. Now, in the fourth industrial revolution, production is going to be automated. And because it has been automated, those countries that automate are going to become much more competitive than us. And ultimately, if we do not compete, ultimately, those jobs that we are trying to save by preventing ourselves from automating are simply going to migrate elsewhere. And we are going to be thrown into the dustbin of history. So what we ought to do is to prepare our people to master these technologies, to prepare our companies to adopt these technologies so that we can remain competitive and continue to produce those goods and services here in South Africa rather than import them.
I think that's such a critical point. I mean, the sector that you're talking about and the reason that it is in the dustbin of South Africa's industry is that they simply didn't invest. They didn't invest in upgrading technology. They didn't invest in their people. So as you say, you get left behind if you don't do that. But interestingly, our banking sector seems to be one sector that is investing in 4IR and stands to gain much and potentially lose much from 4IR. I mean, on the one hand, banks can reduce operating costs. I think you quote a number of 22%. They can digitize their offerings. They can add value to customers. And as you point out, if they don't, they're going to get upended by nimbler, quicker fintech organizations. So my question to you, though, is how do we transform the banking sector? How do we take it forward in a way that's good for the economy and good for financial inclusion? Because smart fintech doesn't always target the whole population, does it?
Yeah. Firstly, I need to just differentiate two key concepts as far as banking is concerned: fintech and tech fee. So a tech fee is when you take an existing traditional bank and you digitize it. You have apps that replace branches, and people can be able to make transactions without necessarily going to the branch and so on and so forth. But you still have the traditional bank. And then fintech is when you start having a new form of banks.
Right.
We know about Allianz, part of Alibaba. It is Amazon is getting into that domain. Then that is a completely different banking system. So in South Africa, we are getting the fintechs. Bank Zero, for example, is another bank that is actually emerging. And as our people get into the digital highway, then you are going to have a very interesting competition in that space. Again, whoever is going to have a competitive edge will ultimately win in that particular sector. Of course, the traditional banks have much more regulations, and maybe the pace of might not be as fast as what we see when we go to Asia, where the banks. Allianz is bigger than Goldman Sachs. It did not start off as a bank. It was just because people are going to Alibaba that Alibaba realized that how about if we create a system that will be able to assist these transactions? That was the birth of that bank. Yeah.
So Bank Zero is arguably the closest that comes to a true fintech operation, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So Prof, let's talk about leadership. From what I understand about this new environment, leadership requirements or the requirements of leaders are changing. And in that education, the way we teach people and educate our school-going pupils, also in our universities, how we teach people to operate, how we teach them to think is changing. And perhaps in your answer, if you'll touch on why the University of Johannesburg is the first and only university in the country to offer a degree in politics, economics, and not philosophy, but technology.
Yeah. So, I mean, education is very important. Maybe if I can just relate a story how I came up with the idea of politics, economics, and technology. I was invited to speak at the Oxford Union. I think that was 2-3 years ago. And the Oxford Union is a very old institution, traditional. They take me to a place where I sign a huge book, which has signatures of Albert Einstein, Winston Churchill, all the people who came, and Malcolm X, all the people who came and spoke at the Oxford Union, just to intimidate you. And then I found out that lots of people who later became prime ministers of the United Kingdom, of Australia, of New Zealand, of Canada, actually came to Oxford to study, and almost all of them studied a degree called PPE, PPE, Politics, Philosophy, and Economics. And as I was thinking about how the world, where we are as the world, I realized that, man, there is a missing puzzle here. Technology is clearly changing all aspects of our lives, much more significantly than any other thing that we have witnessed over the last few years. I mean, just Mark Zuckerberg, he effectively has more than 2 billion followers, because he can be able to post anything on Facebook, for example. And I say, maybe we need to think of a course that will prepare people not only to understand politics, not only to understand economics, but also at the same time to understand technology. And these are the new breed of leaders that we require in the fourth industrial revolution. And I think just by that, it is quite clear that our educational system must become much more multidisciplinary. Those people who are studying technological areas, science and technology areas, must also at the same time study human and social sciences, and vice versa. And the Americans actually have done this for quite a while. And that explains something that I have also observed, that in this new economy, whether you look at the platform economy, whether you look at social networking economy, the Europeans are nowhere to be found. I don't know of any Western Europe version of Facebook or Twitter or Amazon and so on and so forth. And part of the reason is because their educational system is too specialized. And I studied in the United States as an undergraduate student, and in Europe as a doctoral student. And I can tell you that the British specialized even before, at A levels, and I did A levels. They are already doing 3 subjects, mathematics, chemistry, and physics. This is what I did in my A levels. Whereas when I arrived in the United States to study engineering, I had to take 12 semesters of social sciences. I studied acting, I studied psychology. Later on, when I was doing AI and I was learning reinforcement learning, I already knew about it because I learned it in psychology. So multidisciplinary education is very important.
That's the answer.
This era.
So at this point, Prof, I'm going to bring in a couple of questions from our audience. So Julian Kruger has posed 2 questions, and it may cover a little bit of what we've been talking about, so it seems a good time to bring it in. He's asking, how can mobile first design and implementation be harnessed to address some of our education challenges?
Oh, well, I mean, one of the things, and I come from one of the most rural parts of this country, the only small part of South Africa that is north of the Tropic of Capricorn. That is where I come from. Very, very rural. And you go to some of these rural areas and you say, how in the world do teachers even be able to teach some of the subjects? Last week, I was I have a vice chancellor's reading group, and I was reading a book, A Tale of Two Cities, and I'm saying these are books that are prescribed in high school. How in the world does a teacher from some rural area read a book that refers to a country called Gaul, which of course we know it as France now, but that was certainly before the Julius Caesar invaded it, and the only way they can be able to know all that information is to use our online platforms. Every topic that you can think of, there is a material that is available online. And of course, it will mean that teaching should become different, should rely more on data. And some of this data come through mobile telephone. It will mean that we also need to create content that is mobile related so that we can scale good teaching in South Africa. I think it's very, very important.
So Naledi, I'm coming to your question now, but Jeremy's question seems to tie in with the education. It seems our audience education is a hot subject. So I don't know if you've got your finger on this button, Prof, but what's happening in our schools? What's in the works to bring the school system? I mean, you're talking about how the university system needs to change. Our school system, is there some thinking, senior levels, government levels, about how to bring the schools, how to bring 4-hour education, teaching, thinking into our schools?
Look, I will have to also put it forward that I'm a bit of a critic of quite a great deal of our educational system. And that is why later on, maybe I will talk about some of the things that we have introduced at University of Johannesburg, such as artificial intelligence for every student who comes to the University of Johannesburg. Now, it's compulsory. So I hear sometimes people talking about teaching people how to code. We should introduce coding in our schooling system. I think it's a wrong model. I know how to code, obviously, and I think instead of teaching people how to code, you should teach them 3 key skills. 1, communication, especially in English. Why? Because the syntax, whether it is Python, whether it is C++, whether it is Java, it is in English. If you go to China and you see them programming, yes, they probably will be programming in Chinese, but the syntax is in English. So it's very important if you have to get into the world of coding to learn how to do in English, because the platform that is available is in English. Secondly, the ability to do basic mathematics, and we have talked about mathematics quite a great deal. Very, very important. Thirdly, which I have been battling to figure out where it fits into our curriculum, the ability to think logically. That whole concept of saying, go and write to me how you would cook curry. Of course, you will give me a menu. A menu is what we call an algorithm in computer linguistics. That structured thinking about flow of information or flow of things from one point to another. Very, very, very important. If you have those 3 key skills, then programming becomes an easy thing to in fact, you will be able to move from one programming language to another with absolute ease. And I think those are the ideas that we need to impart in our education system. Sometimes people think introducing devices is that's all we need to do. No, it is important, obviously, especially to access information, but certainly those key skills.
Okay. So we can't solve the education problems within our short hour, so I'm going to move us along. And Naledi wants to know, it's a question I think that's very relevant to this conversation. What are your thoughts on the risks to citizens and governments in terms of data? How do we make the leap towards 4IR at the same time protecting confidential information? It seems Naledi is saying that I feel the race in 4IR is moving so much faster than policy and protection mechanisms to truly combat the risks.
Well, Naledi, I don't want to sound like a salesperson. I think my book actually covers that very, very well. I have a whole section on data, on data, you know, and data is the issue around data is very complicated. The Fourth Industrial Revolution recommendation, which are also in the book, there is a recommendation just to deal with issues of data. How do you store data? How do you process that data? Do you go and build a data center, or do you go and rent a cloud from Amazon, Microsoft, or any other cloud providers? Very, very important. Issues of data heritage. I have a chapter on that. The fact that we have data that we inherited, language. When Google takes our language and put it into a device, which they call Google Translate, and sell it back to us, what does it mean? Do we need any governance around data? You know? Issues of cybersecurity. Given the fact that in the Fourth Industrial Revolution we are going to move away from digital computing, where we communicate with ones and zeros, to a much more complicated form of communicating, which basically will make our systems vulnerable for cyber attacks. What do we do about that? Issues around the monetization of data. You know, we know very well that Google is taking huge amounts of data from the African continent and selling it. So when they go and put a $1 billion plant, research center in Accra, it's not because it is they are doing it because of a good heart. I think they are eyeing the African database. You know, all those things need to be understood. They need to be regulated, but we should not regulate it in a way that will stifle, you know, innovation. The Europeans have something called the GDPR, you know, which is basically a data regulatory framework, you know, and I think we need to have our own so that we can be able to use our data and exploit it responsibly.
You talk about a British mathematician, Clive Humby, and he talks about data as the new oil. And I think, you know, South Africa, well, not so much South Africa, but Africa has been exporting its oil for refining in other countries for decades. So we really need to harness our data and take advantage of the data. I mean, how do we do that? How important is it to, for example, create an African health database or a database of faces so that we can get facial recognition systems to work when they're identifying Black women? Apparently the error rate is 1 in 1,000 versus 1 in 1,000,000 for white faces. That's all because there's not enough African data out there. Is that right?
No, absolutely. I think the issue of data being a new oil is very, very important. The issue of, I mean, just think about it. Public hospitals gather all these X-ray images. All these X-ray images. Problem number one, it is not on a unified database. It's stored there and it's stored there. Imagine if you put it in one area, and after you have put it in one area, secure it. I have to put this forward, that you need to secure it, because I have had a situation where I was given a database of the health of people from an organization in South Africa. I'm not going to name any names, and then I found out that it has names of people written on each of the images. And you would have hoped that maybe it is people who lived in 30 years ago. No, it was like fresh data. We literally took, I mean, that was like 15 years ago. We literally took the whole database and said, please remove the names of people and give us the data. So you have to protect people's identity, anonymize it. If you have that database, then we can create an AI system that will be able to look at an X-ray image and say, this is pulmonary embolism. Now you stimulate an industry just by making data available. Of course, it's not going to be simple because, for you to make it available, your data governance framework must be absolutely, without any doubt, very well. The issue of cybersecurity will have to be absolutely flawless so that we can be able to use this to create new industries that can actually be used beyond the shores of South Africa.
Well, in that, I like Sue George's comment here. She says, we've got Poppy and it's coming at us like a train. So I guess that's talking about data security and privacy issues and using, how we treat people's confidential information.
You see, the big problem is that, yes, South Africa's data is not secured. And the Poppy Act is not even addressing this issue. Every day, when you go to Twitter and sign up for Twitter, some agreement pops up. That agreement does not even recognize what the Poppy Act actually is all about. It's between the person who wants to get into that platform and a company in California. And then they make an agreement, and then you have your Twitter account or your Gmail account or your whatever platform, LinkedIn or Facebook, all these things. And after that agreement is struck, they can extract as much data about you, where you are, what you're doing, and so on and so forth, without any regard to the Poppy Act. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that while we craft these laws, it is very important that our lawmakers are scientifically literate. They are technologically literate. Because if they are not, you will have these blind spots. Now, of course, you can regulate your hospital, but that's a very small aspect of South Africa's data heritage. It's just a small part.
Okay. So Prof, let's talk about technology for a second, because let's talk about 5G, because any discussion about 4IR becomes almost academic without touching on the subject of spectrum allocation and 5G. I mean, we can't have 4IR without that, is what I'm led to understand. And the good news is that the spectrum auction process is unfolding. It's urgent. We are very far behind what's happening with 5G in the rest of the world. So that's my impression. My question to you is, how important is 5G in terms of 4IR and adopting and moving forward in South Africa?
Well, it is absolutely very important. It is so important that I actually wrote a chapter in the book on 5G, precisely on that. Because 5G, it is going to make connectivity very, very quickly. So if you are going to have robots, now they want to use the word cobots because they say it is going to be a cooperation between a human and a robot. For them to navigate a plant, they will have to communicate with one another. And when I was talking to the European Union chamber here, they were saying that no, European companies that are operating in South Africa, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and so on and so forth, they don't want their robots to be communicating through MTN or Vodacom or any of the organization. They need their own spectrum. So spectrum is very, very important. It's a bottleneck. We have spectrum that we can use. One of the spectrum that we intended to use was the broadcasting spectrum. When SABC broadcast, they use a great deal of spectrum because they are using an old technology called analog communication technology. So what we need to do is to digitize our television system, our community, our radio and television system. And of course, last time I was sitting with President Thabo Mbeki in, I think it must be 2005, talking about the digitization of our broadcasting. Today, 15 years later, we have not made any progress. Very, very important. Then we can release a spectrum in that spectrum. Then the other thing that is also important, these telecommunication companies are forced to support 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G. And the reason is because in our regulation, there is no regulation that says that, that Nokia phone, it no longer works. If you have it, throw it away, so that MTN or any other company can actually be able to use that capability, including the spectrum, to support 4G or 5G. Very, very important. For 15 years, we have not awarded any spectrum. We need to award spectrum to release the space. Spectrum is basically the digital space that you really require in order for you to be able to communicate, to send data, and so on and so forth. We need that space.
So I didn't know this, but Malcolm's just told us that China's just launched their 6G plan today, which is pretty terrifying. I'm not sure what that means for us and what it means for the rest of the world. Perhaps it's still academic, or perhaps it's still in a research lab. I'm not sure. Have you got a thought on that?
No, I mean, we were expecting this. I'm sure the Americans are also working on this. So because speed is the key issue. Yeah. And one thing that I've actually realized, ever since the lockdown, our internet has become slow. That is why spectrum is very, very important. Our internet has become slow because you have more people who want to use that bandwidth. And I'm not even talking about at Dutuni, my village. I'm talking about here in Sandton. I'm finding out that even just downloading messages on my phone is relatively slower than last year. Simply because many people now are using more data. So the issue of spectrum is more urgent than ever.
Yeah. Well, hopefully the auction will take place on the scheduled dates and we will move forward in that regard. But let's talk about blockchain for a second, because we know blockchain simply as the technology that underpins crypto technologies. But its use goes so much further than crypto. And I know that you have said before that it's a fundamental driver of the fourth industrial revolution. It's disrupting the world of work, from auditing to banking to supply chains, healthcare provision, tax collection. Are we ready here in South Africa and across the continent in Africa to deploy blockchain? Have we got the skills? Have we got the electricity to support it?
Well, I mean, those are the things that we need to build. It is pretty clear that blockchain actually does require quite a great deal of energy, but you don't actually have to run it terrestrially. You can run it from the cloud. So you just need connectivity in that regard. So instead of miners, these are the mining concept in blockchain is when they are basically solving the puzzle so that they can unlock they can unlock the information. does consume huge amounts of energy. So given our electricity problems, I will just recommend that we run it in terms of skills. We asked a question, a very simple question: how many universities are teaching blockchain technology? And I wouldn't even generalize it. Maybe even computer science department. You know, you have computer science department at University of Rwanda, University of Limpopo, Cape Town, Rhodes, and so on and so forth. And we're quite disappointed that these new technologies that are very, very important have not made it into some of our universities' curriculum. Internet of Things, how many of our universities are teaching about that? You know, so it is important for us to be able to be, because these changes are happening so rapidly. You know, now if 6G is emerging, what it means as an educator is to say that I need to be now starting to rethink my curriculum to include 6G now into my teaching. What are the developments? When is it going to happen? What are the principles that they're using to develop it? Where are we? All those things, very, very important.
Sure. I've just been distracted by a question while you were talking about blockchain, which is quite interesting in terms of connectivity. It comes from Nicholas. What about the opportunities that are being afforded by large constellations of satellites, the low Earth orbit satellites that aim to increase internet access around the world? Do you think that's a solution to our connectivity problems?
No, I don't think that is the solution to our connectivity problem, simply because we don't own many of those satellites. You know? I think we need to build the infrastructure here in South Africa. We need to build, some of it is going to be fiber, some of it is going to be, wireless, you know, those towers, which means spectrum, you know. I don't think you have a single thing that will be the answer. It has to be a combination of things. Yes, you know, it can be part of the mix, you know, our communication mix, you know, but I would hope that the most dominant one is actually a direct connectivity, because it tends to be faster. I mean, you know it, you know.
Absolutely.
It tends to be faster than wireless, and so on and so forth.
Prof, I started this conversation by talking about the different sections in your book, and I noticed that society, your discussion on society, actually has probably more chapters than the discussions on business or anything else, and I've left us 12 minutes for this conversation, which is ridiculously short. But we have to consider AI and 4IR and their impact on society. And I know that while AI can be a force for good, it's also taking over tasks performed by humans. And you quoted the late Stephen Hawking, who warned that the emergence of AI could be the worst event in the history of our civilization. But the genie is actually out the bottle. So how do we create ethical AI? And how you answer that question, I'm not sure, but I'm putting it over to you.
Well, we actually need to come together and develop the ethics of AI. The Vatican City, you know, the Catholic Church is teaming up with Microsoft and IBM to develop the ethics of AI. So the churches are involved. You know, the World Health Organization has a committee that is looking at the ethics of AI. I'm a member of that committee representing the African continent. You know, but they are particularly in application to medical offering. You know, these algorithms that are diagnosing diseases better than human beings. What are the ethical dimensions of it? What are the things that we have to keep our eyes much more open and so on and so forth. So we have to invest in sitting down and deciding what is ethical and what is not ethical. And it's not just AI. Issues such as gene editing, you remember the fourth industrial revolution is a confluence of the biological, the physical, and the cyber. And the confluence of that is what is the fourth industrial revolution. What do we do about gene editing? What does it mean? So we need to mobilize people who have been studying this area of ethics, practicing this area of ethics, so that we can be able to.
So, I mean, it's quite a pertinent conversation for this time, because we've just witnessed all of us through our screens, the US election in all of its democratic glory. And it seems that in this election, when compared to the last in 2016, we were, and I use we kind of globally, but the American citizens were much more aware of the possibility that one can be perhaps inadvertently influenced by social media. But I think the question is relevant to all of us. How do we guard against the negation of our democracy through 4IR technologies? And is that a threat? Is it a risk?
It is absolutely a threat. I don't know whether you have been on Twitter. I am a follower of Donald Trump, not political follower, but I follow him on Twitter. And much of what he is tweeting now is being deleted by Twitter, saying that, basically saying that what he's tweeting is misrepresenting the facts. So there are many aspects in which the fourth industrial revolution technology undermine our democracy. Firstly, we know what happened with Cambridge Analytica, harvesting of data, doing a techno-psychological analysis of the data, and segmenting the people who are undecided, using a technology called nudging that comes from behavioral psychology, where you nudge people to act in a certain way without them actually even noticing. Now, all this actually have a huge implication on a concept called free will. Do you have free will if you could be nudged to act in a particular way without even you knowing? And if that particular way is electing somebody to be your president, what does it mean for our democracy? No. And I wrote an article I think 2 weeks back, talking about the book, A Tale of Two Cities. And then I realized that, this fourth industrial revolution is actually giving us a tale of two worlds. The techno barons are emerging as the most powerful people in the world, and the rest. And of course, the book talks about the French Revolution and the that thing, that economic system that existed before capitalism. I just forgot the name.
Feudalism.
Feudalism. So we're entering techno-feudalism now, where the barons are the lords and the rest of us are the serfs, and what do we do about it? And these are important issues, and they're happening right in front of our eyes.
Well, it has the potential to enhance a divide rather than narrow a divide, doesn't it? I mean, you talk about closing the gap, but 4IR could potentially magnify that gap, correct?
Well, and that's the whole point, that yes, we see what is happening. Our democracy is eroding. We see what is happening. We have to be aware that these things are happening. And we need to act now before it is too late. We need to close the gap. You are closing the gap, not of a gap that is stationary. you are closing the gap that is actually widening. It is becoming even a bigger gap. The more you wait, the more it becomes a bigger problem. We need to act now, and we cannot act unless we understand what is going on.
So Prof, society is made up of history, of past, our collective pasts, our memories. So we've spoken about 4IR, we've spoken about industry and society, but what is the role of 4IR when it comes to preserving memory? I went to school and I studied history, and I studied a very specific kind of history because the history I wrote had been documented in textbooks. But we now have an opportunity, I presume, to record history in a way that our subjective biases can possibly be left behind. Is this something we can take advantage of? Because memory is important, isn't it?
No, absolutely. And I do have a whole chapter in the book on memory and the role of the fourth industrial revolution. What is happening is that it is a blessing and a curse at the same time. It is a blessing because all of us have the opportunity today of recording history as we see it, because the platforms for distributions are now available for all of us. You don't have to go and make an agreement with a big publisher for you to be able to diffuse your ideas. But the problem is that too much information, that many of it is not verified, can also distort history. Too many alternative facts are emerging as a result of the fourth industrial revolution. And we have to be vigilant. We have to say which are the platforms that we can rely on, which are the platforms that are suspect. Because for every information that you look for, there's information that is absolutely not accurate. Simply because even the people who are advancing propaganda are using the same platforms as the people who are advancing the truth, or whatever you may call it.
So it seems that with or without the fourth industrial revolution, we as a species are perhaps going to repeat history. We're destined to repeat history again and again. Or can we save ourselves from ourselves?
Yeah, I'm reminded of a statement. History always repeats itself. First as a farce, and second as a tragedy. I think it was Marx who said that.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see this time and time again.
We've been quite serious and sober, but let's talk about how how AI is disrupting our notions of sport and some of, if you're watching Wimbledon, then there's the line judge, and there's so many advances in technology that are changing how we play, how we watch, how we experience top level sport, as well as how these athletes train. Do we risk taking the fun out of sport? And
I think more technology is going to add to the fun. Yes, it was fun when Maradona scored that goal in 1986 using his hand, and nobody could tell because we did not have technology.
But now we know.
Now we know. We know after the fact. They went home with that cup, by the way. And now with this technology, you can be able to prevent Maradona's hand of God, and get a much fairer sport.
Okay. On that note, Prof, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I think we could talk to you for another hour without a problem at all. But time has run out, so thank you for your time. Thank you to our audience for staying with us. Thank you to our sponsors, and have a fantastic day, everyone.
Thank you very much.